Today on The Lead on News 24, we drill down layer by layer into two high-profile murder cases. That's the Murray murders and the assassination of the Madlanga Commission's witness, D. Marius van Merwe, and draw out three key suspects who've all enjoyed past ties to a central figure in the country's often highly violent and extremely lucrative tobacco industry. Let expert investigative journalist and Mafia State author Kyle Cowan take you down this organised crime rabbit hole next.
Overarchingly, as South Africa settles towards, a more lawless state where murder for hire is seen as increasingly an option, as increasingly a viable route to take rather than to fight someone in court or to go to the police for a resolution. Because, of course, also, if you are to some degree or not involved in smuggling of tobacco or the manufacturing of cigarettes or these sort of things, there's always going to be this cloud of suspicion.
Later in our regular segment, South Africa went nuclear on this day in South African history.
New episodes of The Lead air Monday through Thursday at 7 p.m.
In Roby's Pointless Braai Quiz, what's the long-held name of a well-known and historic Karoo town whose residents are now currently up in arms both for and against its current contentious name change? Bonus points if you can tell us what the new name is.
This is The Lead, and this is the South African story with your host, Graeme Robenheimer.
Moving to our top story today, and when he's not delving deeper into South Africa's unofficial Mafia State, well, he's fawning over superbikes and watching reruns of the original Star Wars trilogy. He's our learned friend. He's investigative journalist and author Kyle Cowan. Kyle, how's it going? What an introduction.
Graeme, you're giving away all the state secrets here. Thank you for having me on, as always.
Straight off the bat, this is something that reads like a movie, and I'm quoting some of the News 24 subscribers, the readers of your story this morning, Carl. It's important that I think for our lead listeners that we build some layers and context first, and then we can drill down into the various aspects that link the following role players together. It's quite the story, and I tip my hat to you, sir. Firstly, who were the father and son duo, Clutter and Thomas Murray, and who was the prime suspect in their assassination? A case that, of course, remains unsolved to this day. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, so as we speak, it's 3 years to the day, 18th of March, 2023. Clutter and Thomas Murray were liquidators, insolvency practitioners. Clutter had built a formidable reputation, I think, as being if not the foremost, one of the foremost insolvency practitioners in the country. When SARS had a problem, with a high-profile case, they would turn to him. Some of the state capture insolvencies and sequestrations were handled by him. He was, I think, widely considered to be the best in the country, and someone who I interacted with quite extensively and argued with and butted heads with quite extensively around the liquidation of Bosasa, another very infamous company that he was appointed to, and I was obviously investigating. And it's around this time that I also met Thomas Murray, his son, who was, following in his father's footsteps and was most likely of the two sons to take over the family business one day. And on the 18th of March, 2023, just after 2:00 in the afternoon, it was a Saturday. A white Ford Ranger Bucky pulled up next to the Toyota Prado that Clutter Murray was driving, and Thomas Murray was sat in the front passenger seat, and a passenger in the front passenger seat of the white Ranger Bucky opened fire on their car, wounding Thomas fatally. Thomas died at the scene, and Clutter Murray was hit at least 6 times and died the following morning in hospital. And, as part of my investigations for News 24, from very early on, I think within a couple of months, a guy called Burnett Hermanus, he went by the name Blush or Mr. B or just Bernard. He was quite well known in sort of Joburg quasi-underworld and underworld circles. And he became suspect number 1 for being the person who actually shot the Murrays on that day.
Yeah. So lead listeners, remember that name as we delve deeper into the story, Bernard Hermanus or Mr. B. Secondly, let's remind our lead listeners about who Marius Vlam van der Merwe was. Of course, a story that has been more contemporary in recent months. A top private security official known on Gauteng's East Rand. He was involved in operations targeting Zama circles. And then, of course, gunned down last year in the driveway of his home after testifying as witness D at the Madlanga Commission, and at that commission, he's implicated senior Kuruleni Metro police officials.
Yeah, so I think, witness D, Marius van der Merwe, he testified about, a lot of things. But the standout, the absolute shock and awe of his testimony was this incident in April of 2022, where EMPD officials and private security officials, including Mr. van der Merwe, went to a house in Brakpan, and there Mr. Emmanuel Mbense was tortured. He was tubed. It's an old police trick to try and get people to talk and give information. And he was eventually killed during that process. And Marius van der Merwe took the Madlanga Commission step by step through the events that happened that night and how he was then instructed to actually go and dump the body. And the shocking thing here, obviously, for Mr. Mbense's family is that they had to wait 3 years for an anonymous witness to come and reveal these details before a public inquiry, which I think must have been, heartbreaking for them. But the long and short of that story is that Mbense was suspected of having been involved in a robbery, and these EMPD guys were, they were there to get information and trace the suspects. And I think that story will obviously go a bit deeper. The actual nature of the goods stolen, I think once we get into that, will also be quite revealing for some of these characters. But critically and importantly, witness D and Marius van der Merwe, his testimony revealed the involvement of other private security officials in addition to these EMPD people. And that has been traced by SAPS, linked directly to his shooting on the night of the 5th of December, 2025.
Okay, now we move to our third and final sort of contextual layer, lead listeners, and thank you so much for staying with us through this conversation thus far. Who is tobacco baron Mohammed Sayed, as we know, a co-founder of Carnalinks, and what is this company's controversial history? I mean, this would require at least a whole podcast series in itself.
Yeah, I think the short and sweet version of Carnalinks is that their history, they came up as an independent tobacco manufacturer, i.e. fighting the big companies for market share. Think of your BATs, your JTIs, the very well-known big tobacco companies, those brands that you smoke or that people smoke that are so well-known, your Marlboros, your Dunhills, your Winstons, those sort of cigarettes. And they came onto the market and started manufacturing, cheaper cigarettes, independently manufactured. So less overhead costs, less international, less moving of money to overseas and such things, and really punched above their weight for a long time. And you will remember, if I can take our listeners back even a little bit further, you'll remember the controversy around the high risk investigations unit at SARS, and Mr. Johan van Lochrenberg, who's written about these events in some of his books, which I highly recommend. Was at the instance of the tobacco industry. It was because of investigations that, well, not only, but primarily because of investigations that unit had started to get involved with in the tobacco industry, because there's obviously a lot of, tax dodging going on, a lot of tobacco smuggling going on. And these companies will all tell you that they're not involved in any of these unlawful activities, that it's just SARS trying to, get blood from a rock and all of these sort of arguments. But Mo Sayed, yes, he's one of the co-founders alongside some other very well-known figures, including Mr. Adriano Mazzotti and the late Martin Wingate Pierce and Kyle Phillips. And Carnalinks is really the standout sort of success story of these independent tobacco manufacturers. It's by far, I think, the biggest of those that came up, in the sort of the early 2010s. And their flashy lifestyles are lived on social media. We see the fancy houses and the fancy cars and even private jets now. So well-known, figures that are sort of discussed quite regularly online.
Yeah. Okay, I know this is going to sound funny, lead listeners. If you want to pause and go back the estimated 8 minutes or so and re-listen to this context, please do so. Because we're going to drill down now, and Kyle's going to hold our hand as we do so. So now the key suspect in the Murray murders case was, as you said, Bernard Hermanus. Why does his profile matter so much in the context of South Africa's tobacco industry, and how does he lead as a profile to Carney Links in the context of our story today?
Bernard Hermanus, he was operating as a businessman. He had his trucks. He was, semi-involved in the mining industry and, trucks for hire and sort of moving things around for people, etc. So he was making a decent living out of that. But before that, he was a salesperson for a motor spares company. And that motor spares company, Kaizen Motor Spares, partly belongs to a guy called Ismail Valley. And Mr. Ismail Valley is also a director of a company called the 357. It's a performance car shop out in Kyalami. It used to be in an area, Rivonia, here in Johannesburg. And very early on, News 24 picked up on Burnett's name because he was going around telling people that he'd been involved in this. And we started looking into him, and we sort of found, that these allegations were credible. And this information was, of course, presented through the Murray family to very senior police officers, including Shadrach Sibia and Richard Shabiri, who quite famously have featured very extensively in these Madlanga Commission hearings.
Yeah.
And one of the things that we came upon relatively quickly as well were these images of Bernard Hermanus with Mohammed Syed, one of the directors of Carney Links. And at that point, I was reminded by my brilliant colleague, Jeff Wicks, who has also, delved quite deeply into the tobacco industry, and in particular, a hit squad that used to operate within this industry run by an EMPD SWAT member called Sebastian Groenewald. And he published a series of articles way back in 2022, sort of unraveling all these various murder plots, and including at one point a plot to blow up the Houghton Mosque with a grenade, with a hand grenade, to in fact kill Mr. Syed himself. That plot was never followed through. Unfortunately, the tobacco industry has had this history, this bloody history of murder and assassination, and not only physical violence, but also dirty tricks campaigns and false flag operations. It is an industry that is marked increasingly by violence, and also marked by high levels of money. Bernard Hermanus' involvement or links to that industry, to me, in the context of what Jeff had, investigated just a few years before, was very important. It was absolutely crucial because it is a training ground for individuals who progress from being normal members of society, as you and I understand it, to, being paid for murder.
Yeah, and I think, let me just add this little nugget. As we've heard at the Madlanga Commission as of Friday last week, via our specialist legal journalist, Karen Morn, that Richard Shabiri, of course, the now suspended head of the SAPS organised crime unit, had in fact admitted to accepting a car loan from the now notorious Vusi Musi Cat Matlala. Tell us a little bit more detail. This blew my mind, actually. Out of everything that you've reported, this really stuck out for me, is that there are actually images of Hermanus, the key suspect in the Murray murders case, seen partying with members of this organised crime unit. Tell us more, Kyle.
It's important information that for a multitude of reasons, we can't publish the images yet. But yes, there are images of Bernard Hermanus drinking expensive cognac and whiskey with members of the Gauteng organised crime unit specifically. And why this is important is because originally, shortly after the 18th of March 2023, if not on that same day that Clutter and Thomas Murray were killed, the day after, the Gauteng organised crime unit under Brigadier Pulane Gopane were appointed to investigate this double murder case. And at the time, I recall thinking that it's quite strange that organised crime were roped into this case immediately, right off the bat. I mean, they had no suspects in mind. They had no idea. It could have been a hijacking gone wrong. Could have been anything. It could have been, any number of, multiple number of types of criminality. But the organized crime guys were appointed to the case right off the bat. And, these pictures only emerged quite recently. But to my mind, without having confirmed these details, it is very telling that we have individuals like Mr. Hermanus, having such close relations with organized crime cops. But again, Graeme, also less surprising now that we are sitting and watching this testimony before the Madlanga Commission. We've always known that there's a level of, corruption and infiltration and bribes being paid. We've never known quite how brazen and out in the open it is.
Yeah, because oftentimes, and I'm just saying this as a quick aside, you'll get, certain South Africans going, so what? We knew that it was corrupt. That's why journalism's so important. These things take time to confirm. They take time for the worms to come out of the cabinet. And only once we see the proof, can we sit back and go, see, this is what has been the case. And I think there's always that very careful wait and see approach. Okay, we're drilling down a little bit further now in the context of who we understand Mr. B or Mr. Hermanus to be. Now enter this very interesting fellow by the name of Mati Pandile Andy Soteni, who was in fact taken into custody over this past weekend in connection with the murder of witness D. Marius van der Merwe on Gauteng's East Rand. Who is Andy and what's his background?
Andy is a highly qualified policeman. He was a member of the police's elite special task force. Now, think of the task force, if you've ever seen that Hollywood movie SWAT with Colin Farrell, that's the type of elitism I'm talking about here. Kicking down doors, using explosives to blow open the side of a building to gain access, hostage negotiation, rappelling from helicopters and rescuing people. That is their job. That is what the STF does. They are the best of the best. And, in my limited interaction with some STF members in the past, I've been left deeply impressed by them, and just hearing some of the war stories and the things that they've gone through in the fight against rampant crime and very highly armed criminals. It's quite impressive. And up until August of 2019, Andy Soteni was a member of the STF, a very highly regarded member, and also. I just want to add as a little note here and something for people to bear in mind, that Major General Nhlanhla Mkhwanazi, who we have to thank for all of these revelations about the police, he himself was the head of STF, which would give you some idea of his background.
He's currently before parliamentarians on the final day of the parliamentary ad hoc committee looking into all of the claims of criminals capturing the criminal justice system as we know it. Just as a by the by, you can check out our live blog as Jan Gerber, our senior parliamentary correspondent, brings us the very latest there. Please continue, Kyle.
And in 2019, after he leaves the police, Soteni is employed by a subsidiary company of Carney Links called Branded World, and he becomes a bodyguard for Mr. Syed and his wife and children. And it is a position that he maintains and occupies up until October of 2024, according to Mr. Syed. And at that point, disagreements between Mr. Syed and Mr. Soteni had reached a point. Multiple verbal and written warnings had been issued. And according to Mr. Syed, he then, takes disciplinary action against Soteni. And the final result of that is actually Mr. Soteni losing his job. Now, that is approximately 1 year and 1 month prior to the shooting of Mr. van der Merwe. So, and I just have to point out here that, again, while we make these links, Mr. Syed was not involved in this. We have no evidence that he was involved in any of these murders. But again, it's just important to draw that link back to the tobacco industry, which, as I've said, has become, so violent and marked with violent death.
Right. But Mr. Soteni, he was the personal bodyguard for the Syed family.
For approximately 5 years, and I can't stress enough that having someone around you for that length of time, so closely interacting with your family members, there is a level of a relationship that builds. And, according to what Mr. Syed told me, the parting was amicable. There was no hard feelings, as it were. And Mr. Soteni went on his merry way.
Sure. But now a key suspect in Marius van der Merwe's murder. Crazy how this is all sort of coming together in its own weird ways. And then lastly, who's this key individual, East Rand security guard Viandre Pretorius, and how does this figure fit into this emerging web that we speak of?
If we go back to the testimony of Mr. van der Merwe in front of the Madlanga Commission, Viandre Pretorius is one of the people that he implicated in having been there that night in April of 2022 with Emmanuel Mbense. And, I think it became very clear that there was a much deeper story here about the private security industry and these MPD cops. And Marius van der Merwe was, ready to talk. He was ready to spill the beans, and he was ready to tell the truth about what had happened. And I think that in a large extent, that would have implicated Viandre Pretorius. Now, Viandre Pretorius, also well-known East Rand security guy, critically very much involved in cigarette smuggling busts, etc. So what News 24 understands is that Viandre, for a time, worked on cracking down on cigarette and tobacco smuggling rings, particularly out of the Limpopo province, and that this work would have been on behalf of either Carney Links or one of its subsidiary companies. So again, now we have the third link, the third alleged hitman linking back to the tobacco industry, and more specifically to Carney Links.
Sure. Okay, you've already sort of indicated the lines of engagement thus far, but what are we ultimately saying throughout all of this, and what are we not saying with regards to all of the profiles that we've alluded to thus far, and how they speak back to South Africa's rather contested, rather combative, rather violent, rather lucrative tobacco industry that often finds itself so interlinked with the politics of today?
Yeah, this story is an important part of the record, in my view. I have spent quite a number of years sort of on the peripheries of investigating things in the tobacco industry. As I mentioned earlier, Jeff Wicks has done, exceptional work a few years ago, unraveling, one element of this and that violent sort of nature that the business is taking on. And I think that overarchingly, as South Africa settles towards, a more lawless state where murder for hire is seen as increasingly an option, as increasingly a viable route to take, rather than to fight someone in court or to go to the police for a resolution. Because, of course, also, if you are to some degree or not involved in smuggling of tobacco or the manufacturing of cigarettes or these sort of things, there is always going to be this cloud of suspicion. And, because we understand how the industry works, we understand how, SARS has been trying to fight this for so many years, and we understand that the illicit tobacco economy, as it is called, is now probably equal to or larger than the licit, i.e. legitimate tobacco trade in this country. So, Graeme, as we South Africans have to confront the realities of organized crime becoming more and more insidious, and the realities of the police's ability to combat that, and the infiltration of the police leading to higher degrees of unwillingness and inability to combat that this sort of violent response, this sort of tendency towards murder and assassination is going to get worse.
I have nothing else to add but to say thank you very much. I really appreciate and understand the level of intense late hours of sketching notes, of drawing back to context. It's a very, very difficult thing to be an investigative journalist in South Africa today. So I'm going to just say thanks. And I appreciate you bringing this story to bear for us. And the lead listeners, thank you too, Kyle.
Thank you very much, Graeme. I really appreciate it.
And finally,
Ending off now with On This Day in South African history, that's the 18th of March, 1965. Well, on this very day, the Safari 1 nuclear reactor at Pelindaba near Pretoria went critical, marking South Africa's entry into the nuclear age. Going critical essentially means that the reactor achieved a self-sustaining nuclear chain reaction for the very first time. The 20 megawatts reactor was supplied by the US-based Alice Chalmers Corporation, along with highly enriched uranium to power it. Apartheid South Africa's nuclear program started out as a research effort, however it later evolved into a weapons program. And today we remain the only country ever to voluntarily dismantle our nuclear arsenal, which was widely believed to have been driven by the end of apartheid, the transition to a democratic rule, and a desire to rejoin the international community without this burden hanging over our heads. And now for the answer of Roby's pointless Braai quiz for today. What's the long-held name of a well-known and historic Karoo town whose residents are now currently up in arms both for and against its current contentious name change? Bonus points if you can tell us what the new name is. Well, that answer is, of course, Graafrenet. And the bonus point answer is Robert Sobukwe Town. Have you got a comment on this story? Tell us more below. And if you haven't seen the headlines just yet, well, it's all confirmed, signed, sealed and delivered. President Cyril Ramaphosa will be addressing News 24's very special On the Record Summit this year. That's this Thursday and Friday at the Cape Town International Convention Centre. Of course, as I said in yesterday's episode, this year's theme is how do we create 5 million jobs in 10 years? And as the presidency points out, the On the Record Summit follows a 9-month research project undertaken by News 24 and the Africa Centre, and that's to consult around 60 influential South Africans across academia, business and civil society on tangible solutions that could be implemented to create 5 million jobs in the next decade. The debate is happening, and it's all going to be centered around News 24's On the Record Summit this Thursday and Friday. Of course, the lead will be there to bring you the highlights from both of those days. Expect our coverage to come out a little bit earlier in the day, and that's going to be around your mid-afternoons of both Thursday and Friday. We'll wrap all the best, the juiciest nuggets from this debate. How do we get South Africa moving into a space that creates wealth for everyone on an inclusive front? That really is where the conversation is right now. Well, until then, my name's Graeme, and so long as there's trusted news first, we'll have the lead.